Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
She sees that I'm filming and she shouts to Mladic, she shouts, "Umpravov's filming you." And everyone stops. And before I know it, Ratko Mladic, one of the notorious war criminals of all time, he points to the camera, he says, "Mladic," which is young man, "u vas samo jedan život." You only have one life.
Richard Linton's life has taken him from Cold War Moscow to the deserts of the Gulf War and the shattered streets of Sarajevo. In this powerful episode, he recalls studying in the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev years and later serving as a tank commander during the Cold War. However, the heart of this conversation is Bosnia, where Richard witnessed the siege of Sarajevo, came face to face with Bosnian Serb war criminal Radovan Karadzic, and narrowly escaped trouble after secretly filming General Ratko Mladic. Richard also describes documenting the aftermath of ethnic cleansing, filming evidence of war crimes and later testifying at The Hague. This is an episode you won't want to miss as he shares his extraordinary journey from North London schoolboy to British Army officer, UN observer, filmmaker, actor and thriller writer. His new book Crown Deception is out now. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Linton to our Cold War conversation.
I was born in Highgate, London, at the Whittington Hospital. My mother called me Richard because of Dick Whittington, and there was a little black stone cat in a cage just outside Whittington Hospital. That's why she called me Richard. I only met my father twice in my lifetime, although he did live close by in North London. I was basically brought up by my mum, who was a single mother in Kentish Town in London. And then when I was a little bit older, we moved to Primrose Hill in London.
Primrose Hill, very nice part of London. And Kentish Town as well, for all my listeners from Kentish Town. But it's good to hear you're a North London boy, same as me. What was schooling like?
I was born in 1966, went to Kentish Town Primary School, and then went to William Ellis School on Highgate Road, just up the road there. So that was, when I was 11 or 12. 70s we're talking now.
What were your favourite subjects at school?
Oh my God, that's easy. So I loved languages and I studied French, and I went off to, when at age 16, had amazing exchange programs in France. And then I tried Spanish, but I didn't like Spanish, so they told me to switch to German. So my two favorite subjects were definitely French and German. And then I ended up going to Exeter University and I studied beginner's Russian, which again pretty much changed my life, I would say. So yeah, those were my two favorite subjects even in high school. And thankfully to the good old ILIA in the London Education Authority, they sent me on not one but two exchange programs, which miraculously, and especially as me, I live in America now, it was free. I remember going to the great, what was it, the town hall, on the embankment. Anyway, they gave me an award to go and study in France and Germany. Yeah, County Hall. I remember going down there and getting this sort of mini award. So languages was definitely my thing.
Brilliant. Yeah, because at my comprehensive, they did offer Russian, which was
really wow.
It was in Southgate in North London, so it's Ashmole Comprehensive. I went to that. Okay, they offered Russian. That was beyond my language skills. I struggled with German and French enough, rather than a completely different Cyrillic alphabet. There. And what were your career aspirations when you said you went to University of Exeter? Where did you think you were going to go in life?
So at that stage, I was what they called a cadet to go into the Household Cavalry, the Lifeguards in the British Army. And in other words, I got paid to go to university. I got about £5,000 a year, I remember. And so I always knew I was going to Sandhurst after university. And even though I spent a year in Moscow, which they were happy but not happy about because they thought I might be compromised. And I was actually a serving officer in the British Army, technically, while I spent a year in Moscow, which was interesting. And I knew that I might want to go into the Foreign Office one day, but I was going to start in the British Army as a tank commander in the Lifeguards.
So this was the time of Perestroika and Gorbachev.
Absolutely. It was a summit between Reagan and Gorbachev. And it was just a spectacular time to be there because the Afghanistan war had just ended. So the Russians were keen to start making friends with the West again. And we happened to be in Moscow during that time. And I remember there were many stories, but ended up doing interpreter work for Ian Glover James from ITN during that Reagan Gorbachev summit. And everyone was so happy because it was like East and West making friends again. It was really a fantastic and wonderful time to be there.
So what was that year? Was that 88 or something like that?
So 87, 88, yeah.
The Moscow population that you conversed with, they were excited about Gorbachev then, or were the wheels coming off the reforms already at that point?
Oh, no, this was the heyday. They loved Gorbachev and they just loved foreigners. It was like being a billionaire being a student in Moscow, because you would exchange the rubles, like officially it was 1-to-1, $1 for 1 ruble, where we literally had certain students would go to the общежитие, the hall of residence at the end of the tube line, and we would take $100 or $500 and literally come back with a carrier bag full of rubles as a student. And then we would go and spend these rubles in Soviet restaurants and live like kings, basically. So the people were wonderful. I remember I was determined to learn Russian, and I purposefully avoided any or as much contact with other British students as I could, and I would just go off and explore. And for example, I went to this opera house, this little sort of opera house right in the center near the Arbat. And I just walked in, could just walk into places in those days because they had security everywhere. And if you were a foreigner, they didn't stop you. And I remember just sitting in this empty auditorium of this opera house, watching this rehearsal, thinking, this is so cool. This is so cool. And then I actually met one of the guys who sang in the opera and ended up being great friends. And I would go to his house. He was like one of my best Moscow family friends. And every weekend I would go out on the tube line to the end of the tube line, Gorod Balashikha. It was like a closed part of Moscow. So technically I shouldn't have even been there. And then I would get on what they call the trolleybus, a little local bus. And I would go into basically this concrete jungle. And again, my friend told me, listen, this is a closed city. You're not allowed here as a foreigner. So just wear a Russian fur hat and a coat and just pretend to be Russian. And this was like exciting for me as a sort of 19, 20-year-old, I guess I was. But anyway, I was determined to get into the Russian psyche, the Russian sort of way of life. And I would just spend the night actually with this lovely family and a little daughter, and the mother and father would just cook and we'd drink vodka and he'd play the guitar. So yeah, it was a really special time. I was there in the snow. So again, it was even more atmospheric. And I remember they had a little kino theater, a little cinema just close by. And I always remember they were showing Harry Potter. Harry Potter was on in the movie theater, in this concrete jungle. I just was very privileged. And just the fact that they would sing and play songs and they read books, it was just amazing. And it was before I went back a few years later, and it had just been spoiled by all the Western influences. So yeah, it was a fantastic time to be there. And I wasn't even thinking about writing at that stage, but definitely all these experiences like mounted up, and many years later I was able to use them.
Yeah, so I guess a time full of hope as to the future of the Soviet Union. It wasn't necessarily thought it was going to implode. But then shortly after, when the Soviet Union does disappear and Yeltsin comes to power, there's massive inflation. Yeah, did you take many photos when you were there?
I did, yeah. Unfortunately, I actually lost a lot of them. They disappeared one day, and I always wondered whether it was like the KGB broke into my house and took them. But this whole box of photographs that I had, because you would keep the roll of film in those days, and you have to either send them back with someone or develop them later. But yeah, I took some wonderful pictures, even though you weren't supposed to in those days. And I got into quite a few scrapes just trying to take pictures of Russians in various places.
And when you say scrapes, can you elaborate as to what happens there?
Oh, gosh. Like mini scrapes, really. Going into Len Film Studio, like we went to Len Film Studio one time, and I wanted to go right into the studio, and I wanted to see some filmmaking, and I had my camera, and I tried to take pictures, and so the Provodnitsa, the old babushka, and they called the policeman outside, said, there's a foreigner here taking pictures, and so they kicked me out. But as soon as you show them your British passport, they didn't want to be troubled to do anything. And then another time, I guess, when we went to Khabarovsk, we went on a 6-day journey to Khabarovsk in the snow because I told our KGB minder at the Institute in Maris Teresa, the Maris Torres, which is now the Moscow State University, I think. But anyway, I told him we wanted to go to Khabarovsk. We wanted to go on a 6-day journey across Russia in the snow. And he was like, oh, Richard. And he said, no pictures, because we couldn't go to Vladivostok was a closed city, so we couldn't go there. So the next best was Khabarovsk, which is close by. But anyway, so we got there and it was like River Amurk was covered in snow, this frozen tundra. And then our in-tourist guide was clad in a mink fur coat and mink hat. And I fell in love with her, really. I've had a crush on her immediately. And I was always trying to take photos and they were always saying, no photos. And then I always remember one during that stay in the Russian Far East, our minder and his assistant, they were drinking in their room because all they took on the train was a holdall, like a big holdall. And I said to Sasha, this minder, what's in it? And he went like that. And it was just full of vodka bottles. And so they literally spent 5 days just drinking on the train. And then they had more for when we got there. But anyway, when we were in the hotel one night, they invited me to their rooms, and they were pretty drunk. They were pretty far gone. And I went into the room and they were joking. Said, no cameras, no photography. So I said, sure, it's in my room. But anyway, so then they started doing something rather strange. They said, right, Richard, we play a game and we give you 1 star. And they took out a real Russian officer's epaulette and they had these little brass, well, they're probably goldy metal buttons. And they said, we give you button, you become colonel, but you have to drink vodka for every star. So then spent the next hour and they're like, hey. And so I wanted to get the 2 epaulettes, which had about 8 stars, I think it was. And so we were drinking and I was getting the stars and I really wanted these military epaulettes because I was going into the army, but they didn't know that I was going into the army because I always said I was going to be a foreign diplomat to these guys. And then they said, Richard, what are you going to do when you leave? And I said, I'm going to be a diplomat. I'm going to be a British diplomat. Are you sure? And so they kept pressing me. And I was just like, oh my God, they probably know that I'm actually going into the British Army. They probably somehow found out because I was technically a British Army officer. Anyway, I digress. I'm babbling on a bit, but those were some of the fun things.
But it's a great detail. This is what we love on Cold War Conversations, is stories like that. And in fact, one of my questions was going to be, did the Soviets know you were going into the army? Was that part of the application for you to what?
So I must just say the best story. I missed the best story. So I don't know whether they knew. All my research later in subsequent years leads me to believe that surely they must have known, but they didn't care because I wasn't even an officer at that stage. I was technically an officer, but I was a cadet and I was going to Sandhurst. But another story just similar that I wanted to tell you because it's fun was we went to Odessa one time on an institute trip. And to the Potomkinskaya Lesnitsa, the 39 steps. And I knew that because of the book. And I thought, oh, wow. And in fact, I'm thinking about using that in my next book, the Potomkinskaya Lesnitsa. Anyway, so we were in Odessa. Me and my friend Simon, we find a group of young Russians and we go out for a sort of dinner. And we're having a lot of fun. And there was a girl who I quite liked. I guess you could say I fancied her. And at the end of the dinner, she said, I'm going home now. So I'll walk you to the port. She said, I have to get a taxi. So we're somewhere near, I don't remember exactly where, but we're somewhere near the 39 steps, the famous steps. And we walk down the steps and she's going to get a taxi home. And suddenly we hit halfway down and she says, come in, let's go and sit down. I'm like, oh, maybe she wants to have a smooch or something. So we go in and suddenly these 2 Russians appear. One has a knife. And basically she disappears. They say, give me your money. And I realize I'm getting robbed and I'm going like the Bertie Wooster sort of thing. But I'm a British diplomat. I'm going to be a British diplomat. So they took some money and they let me have my passport, which was great. But long story short, we went to the police station and they weren't interested. They said, oh, sorry, very sorry. And then we went back but we reported it. Then we go back to Moscow and 2 weeks later, this detective arrives in Moscow at our institute for me. And they say, we think we found the man who robbed you. And he said, but we want you to come to Odessa. I'm like, what? I'm not going to Odessa to identify this guy. But then we thought, I said, can my mate Simon come with me? And I said, yeah, sure. And I said, are you gonna fly us there? And they said, yes, of course, we fly. And so I asked the embassy permission. Said, I want to go and identify this guy. I think they found who robbed me. Because basically we thought it would be an adventure. And so then there was really bad weather, so we couldn't fly. So then we had to get on a train with this detective. So it's like a whole day to get back to Odessa. And then when we get there, I'm like, are you going to put us up in a hotel? And the guy says, no, we have very little money, no funds. And I said, where are we supposed to go? So we basically went to the friend's house, some of the friends who we'd met, because as students, we couldn't afford to stay in the posh Odessa hotel. Because the next morning there would be an ID parade at the police station. So next morning we go to the police station, and I'm a bit nervous because I have no idea if it's him, this guy, if I'm going to remember him. And there's this little tin pot police station with an internal courtyard, and I'm in the detective's office, and I see the guys being lined up outside, and I'm looking out, and then I definitely recognize one of them, but the other wasn't quite sure. And he says, we'll go outside. I'm like, what? We're going to go right outside? I'm going to stand in front of these guys who robbed me, really? And he goes, Richard, on nosit churni bruki. And he goes, Richard, the one we want is wearing black trousers. I'm like, okay. So basically, like I say, I definitely recognized the one, but the other one wearing the black trousers, it was 50-50. And so I go out and I'm face to face with these guys. I'm like, oh my God, do I really want to be here? And I thought, and as soon as it was over, I thought, oh shoot, I could get away from these guys. One of them might jump me or something. And then we go back into the police detective's office. And then the two criminals walk right into the same tiny little office and they sit down beside me. I'm like, oh my God. And the guy's going, hey, you robbed the wrong guy. You robbed a future British diplomat. And these guys are sitting there, head down. I think they're in handcuffs. But anyway, that's just one of the examples of the adventures we got up to in my year abroad in Moscow.
Wow. And during that journey, you got quite far into the Soviet Union. Did you get as far as like the Chinese-Korean border?
Yeah. So the amazing thing about Khabarovsk is you could see the Chinese mountains in the distance, and you knew that North Korea was like 50 miles away. And there's this area called, it's the Amur River, and there's a place, it's a known area for development, for the UN was kind of development. So when we went there, that's the farthest you could go. You couldn't go to Vladivostok because that was a closed city, but you could go to Khabarovsk. And that was so magical and incredible. And just going around with this tourist guide, this beautiful girl called Yulia, who I'm still in touch with. We've kept in touch over the years. She lives in Paris now. But anyway, I just thought if I ever write a novel, it's going to start here. And so I thought many years later, great place to start a Jack Steele novel would be at the corner, this section of North Korea, China, Russia. Hardly anyone ever goes there, but talk about potential for political intrigue, spying intrigue. And even though I never got across the border into North Korea, I did decide to use that as the start of North Korea deception.
Right. And does Yulia feature in that one?
She does, yeah, she does. She's one of the main protagonists, and I won't tell you what happens to her. But yeah, I had to use her. And then I think when I first published it, I think she sent me a very old picture of her, black and white. So in her, I said, "Have you got an old picture, mink fur coat and hat with the snow in the background?" So yeah, she's definitely one of the people I based the story on.
Brilliant. So you graduate from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. What year is that? Is it 1990 or something like that?
Yeah, so 89, 90. And then Gulf War One is on the horizon looming. And as we are finishing at the Royal Armoured Corps Centre in Bovington as our tank training to be tank commanders, they're literally calling people forward on my course to go and join their regiment in the Gulf. So that was 89, 90. And then I got to Germany. The Berlin Wall came down in 89. And so at that time, it was really interesting and exciting because not only did the Berlin Wall was just coming down and we were in Germany, but we knew that we were going to be called up to go to Gulf War One, me as a tank commander. And just another quick fun story. So when the wall came down, I just thought, I've got to go. I've got to get across that border. And I thought, I'll take my soldiers. And we had an adventure training weekend planned. And I asked my soldiers in my troop, as a cavalry officer, you basically got 11 guys plus you, a troop. And I said, do you want to go to East Germany? Do you want to go to the wall? And I go, yes, sir, yes, sir. So I asked permission from my commanding officer. I said, instead of walking in the Bavarian Alps, which most of the other regiment were doing, and we would all go off in private cars to get there. And it was a thing, adventure training. And so I asked permission, can we go into Leipzig? I think that was the nearest place to get to, getting across the wall to Leipzig. And we went in 3 cars. And everyone was excited because even though my soldiers didn't speak German or Russian, they obviously knew it was a big deal that the Berlin Wall just came down. And we were all going off there. And I just remember arriving in Leipzig, and I think I was walking around with maybe 1 or 2 of my soldiers, and I saw a Russian barracks. And I'm like, I'd been in Russia, I'd spent a year in Russia. I felt very comfortable with the Russians. Not sure I would now these days, unfortunately. But I literally went up to the sentry on duty at this Russian barracks. And I said, can I speak to your commanding officer? And I said, I'm a British captain. Can you get your commanding officer? So because I spoke Russian, he did what he was told, sort of thing. And then when I said I was an officer, he definitely did what he was told. Anyway, and again, so long story short is this officer came out. I'd said who I was. I said I'd spent a year in Moscow. Could we come in and have tea? Because I knew the Russians did that. That's their culture. They always have tea. They like to have tea with people. So I took me and 2 or 3 other soldiers. We went to the officers' mess. They gave us tea. We chatted in Russian. I did a little bit of translating for my soldiers. And so we were probably one of the first English soldiers to have tea in a Soviet barracks, I would say, in about 1989.
That's a brilliant story. So was this like literally just after the wall had opened? You went the other way.
Absolutely.
With your troop.
Yeah.
And you were in civilian clothing.
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But I couldn't resist. That's
a great story. You would have been trained for fighting on the northern plains of Europe. And suddenly you're told that you're going to the desert. Did you manage to get any different training, or what happened there?
Yeah, it was terrifying, to be honest, because they suddenly started issuing desert combats. They said, we got training, 2 weeks of training, and we started doing the old NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare training with the hoods and the hazmats and all this stuff. But no one really knew what they were doing, I would say, in retrospect. So yes, so when we found out that we were definitely going to the Gulf, we were going to be what they call battle casualty reserves, which was unsettling because we knew what that meant was we wouldn't be fighting or going into battle as a regiment or even a squadron. We were basically spare parts. And so if someone lost a tank in the main assault, then that meant that they would call one of our tanks. Or if someone lost a whole troop, and again, we didn't know at this stage how bad the war was going to be, it would mean that we would be called forward and have to go into battle with another regiment who we did not know. We did some training in Germany, and pretty scary time, really, especially as a young tank commander. I had no clue what I was doing. I was out of university, so I was about 24. And I just remember flew to Brize Norton, had to wait there for 2 or 3 days, finally got a plane, C-130 is it? I think transporter plane, started flying towards the Gulf. turned around 4 or 5 into the journey, came back to Brize Norton, waited there in this big aircraft hangar with your sleeping bag and your camp bed for two or three more days. Then we finally got the call, we're going out again. So we arrived in, I think it was Al Jabal, and we were in this tent city there. And this was one of the first few nights. We hadn't even got our tanks yet. Our tanks had been taken out on transporter trucks to the middle of the desert, and we were going to go and get them in the middle of the desert. So we were in this sort of tent city in, like I said, I think it was Al Jabal. And I just remember it was the middle of the night, and suddenly there was this massive explosion in the near distance. It wasn't an attack or us. It was just some weird stuff going on. We were pretty sure it wasn't anyone attacking us because we were miles from Kuwait. But anyway, I just remember exhausted from all this pre-training and travel out there and being in the desert and not knowing what's going to happen. And someone goes, gas, gas, gas. So everyone's like getting their suits on and then the gas mask, and then you have to seal it around that mask. And I just remember lying on the bed because basically we were supposed to sleep in it. And I just thought, if I die, because I can't breathe, and if I wake up, then great. But I have this eternal image of these soldiers in their sort of tighty whities getting out their sleeping bags, getting their NBC kit on, or everyone putting the hoods on, and then just being so exhausted that I just lay there thinking, oh my God, I can't keep myself awake any longer. So if I suffocate and don't wake up, I just don't care anymore. But anyway, yeah, so that was the Gulf. It was pretty crazy time.
Because joining the British Army during that period, the Berlin Wall's come down, so you think, great, but the enemy's got
Right,
worst
exactly.
thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get sent to Northern Ireland.
Right,
Then
exactly.
you get sent out to the Gulf, and it's going to be a hot war without any doubt.
Oh, I wanted to tell you, sorry, the other image was just such a bizarre image. So we did finally get taken on a bus, on an old school bus, out into the desert. And they told us during training that the Challenger 2, or maybe it was the Challenger 1 in those days, but they told us had all this up armoring and that it was almost impossible for even an armored piercing shell, if it hit it, it would actually not be able to penetrate. So we were always very excited about our tank. And what I was going to tell you is that when we get there to this literally like basin of tanks, like just dumped in the middle of the desert, there's these Vickers defense guys there. And we're like, what are they doing here? And there were these big panels, these big metal panels. And they were literally bolting extra what they called up armoring onto the side of the tank. And we're like, if it's that good, why do we need the extra up armoring? So I always remember that stands out in my mind as making me even more nervous about the Gulf. But sorry, go ahead.
It's great hearing your stories. Did you advance into Iraq or Kuwait, or were you behind the lines?
So what happened was we were in the desert, basically waiting to be called forward. I did not go into Kuwait. Some of my regiment did. Some of my colleagues who were at the Royal Armour Corps Centre, who trained and graduated Sandhurst, did actually machine gun Iraqi soldiers for real. I was in the desert, and as you probably remember, it literally, thank God, only lasted 3 or 4 days, this war. So luckily I did not have to go into battle at that stage. And probably best, because I don't think I was the best tank commander in the world either. If I'm honest.
We never know now, will we?
Yeah.
While I was researching your story, I found something about you also being a European Community Task Force humanitarian liaison in Moscow. Where does that fit in the timeline?
Yeah.
Is that after?
Yes. So that was 90, I think that was 93. So basically it was the European Community as opposed to European Union. In the old days, it was European Community. So they had this food aid program, and we were sent to Moscow and Leningrad in civilian clothes with an armband. And our job, actually, I must just tell you how that happened. So I was in Germany. It was after the war. I was not having the best time, like stuck in Germany. It wasn't really my thing. So then, I don't know, God, Russia, whatever it was, this bolt from the blue came, and suddenly there was a signal saying they needed Russian speakers for this European Community Task Force. And I went, oh, that sounds interesting. And my adjutant called me in, said, yeah, Dickie, they want you to go up to headquarters interview for this, because I was a Russian speaker. I was a young officer. And he said, but the trouble is the commanding officer doesn't want you to go. He wants you to be unit employment officer. He said, I'll see what I can do. So somehow a senior colonel vetoed my colonel and said, no, we need him. We want to interview him. Went up there to this, I think it was Paderborn, interviewed with an intelligence corps officer. And the next day I was on a plane back to RF Norfolk, just outside London, in civilian clothes. There was one Army officer, one Naval officer, one Royal Marines, and one Air Force, just 4 officers for the entire British services who were going to be part of the European Community Task Force. And somehow I'd landed this spot. And I just remember going into Whitehall. If you ever read my books, by the way, a lot of these scenes you'll remember this. You'll remember them as you read the books. But anyway, I remember going into Whitehall, the old clocks all around the world on the floor for this briefing, given a ton of cash, Deutschmarks, again, almost in a plastic bag because there were so many that were giving us expenses. And then we went out to Russia for, I think it was one month, maybe 2 months. So yeah, it was a really fascinating job. And we stayed in a hotel, and then we would have a private car, and we were in civilian clothes, and we would just go and investigate and check all the shops. It was the food aid arriving, the bags of rice, the bags of flour. We'd go to warehouses. It was really quite fascinating. Yeah. So that was 93, 94.
Right. Did you look up your friends from your previous visit when you were there?
Yes, I did meet up with some old friends, which was great. I took them some gifts because they were still short of things. We were in Leningrad, we were in Moscow. So I didn't have that much time for socializing, but it was a really fascinating time. And as I left, I heard that James Bond, GoldenEye, was going to be filmed in Leningrad. And this must have been just after I left the army. I heard about this movie. I thought, oh my God, I got to see if that's still happening. So I contacted Eon Productions, those 7 people, and I said, I'm a Russian speaker, ex-army, could I come? Because I wanted to go into the film industry eventually. Could I maybe get a job on this movie? So I ended up going back to Leningrad for the tank chase sequence in GoldenEye, which if you remember, a lot of it is filmed in the studio in England, but there's a lot of wide shots where the tank is cruising down the street. And they were shot in St. Petersburg. And I was a 3rd assistant director on that movie. And I used some of these experiences in Leningrad Deception. But the best story from that was that we were filming the tank chase sequence. There was a stunt double for Pierce Brosnan. And there was one scene set on the embankment of the canal in Leningrad. And it's a chase. They're chasing the tank, or the tank is chasing the jeeps. I forget which. But anyway, the tank is cruising down the embankment. Some of you, if you've seen GoldenEye, you'll remember this. And then the jeeps, the Soviet soldiers, are chasing the tank. And there's a scene where the jeeps come out of this tunnel. They crash into the sort of balustrade of the canal, and they fly into the water. So the day before we shot this, the entire production was shut down by the mayor of, I think her name was Sobchak, the wife of the mayor of St. Petersburg, Leningrad, shut the entire production down. And they were asking astronomical sums of money for us to be allowed to film. And they said the tank was destroying all the sewage around the city, which was, of course, rubbish, because this tank was on wheels, basically. It wasn't an actual tank with tracks. So they shut us down, and we were waiting around. And then I guess they came to some kind of agreement, because the wife of the mayor heard that we were going to crash through this balustrade into the canal, and she didn't want any more of the city destroyed. That was the reasoning. Anyway, they eventually allowed us, and we had this great scene they replaced the metal balustrade with, of course, balsa wood painted like metal. There's this incredible scene where the Jeeps come through, they crash through, there's an explosion in the Jeep as the Jeep is crashing through the railing. The stuntmen fly into the water. It was just amazing scene to film and watch. And I was just in heaven basically as a third AD because I was blocking off streets. And then I do use that scene in a mini chase sequence in Leningrad Deception, if you read.
Because I think I found a still that you'd taken of it on either your Facebook or Instagram.
That's right.
The Jeep exploding.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where it's from. Yeah, that wasn't my shot. That was just taken from the internet. But that was the scene that I'm talking about. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, you do some further tours in the army in Bosnia.
So what happened was I was actually on a riding course in Melton Mowbray, which is where the cavalry officers do their riding courses. And I got injured and I got kicked by a horse called Norman, not once, but twice in about 10 minutes, and smashed my knee. It was the end of my riding course. So again, fortuitously at the same time, they were looking for Russian speakers to go and learn Bosnian. So I said, yeah, me please. So we had a 6-month course in Bosnian at the Army School of Languages just in Beaconsfield. And my first tour was as a UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, LO, liaison officer in Sarajevo. Now, at the time when I got this gig, I didn't know there were like 1,500 shells a day landing in Sarajevo, so I might have not been quite as excited about it. But yeah, it was extraordinary time to be there. There were so many deaths already. Again, people may remember it was the year they had to use the soccer stadium in Sarajevo to bury people, and the crosses were just mounting up. It was just horrendous. General Rose was there at the same time. Again, he went in to try and calm things down. And our job was to escort fuel in and out of Sarajevo across the confrontation lines, because the Bosnian Serbs were always blocking the checkpoints. It was a siege. It was a genuine siege, just like Berlin or anywhere else. It was the siege of Sarajevo, and you couldn't get in. There were UN air flights in for UN personnel, but fuel had to be driven in and out. And again, it was a humanitarian role. It was Blue Beret stuff. But I do remember the very first night we got there, and we're in the PTT building, which was the telephone engineer building. So it was like built in the Soviet times, and it was thick concrete walls. Like it could stand any kind of blast. And I went to the dining hall, and it was the French Legionnaires were in there. And remember, I was just a lone British Army officer with a team of 2 other soldiers. So it was just the Brits. But the French were there. I thought, oh, great, we're going to have French cuisine. And it was promising because they had bottles of French wine, little mini bottles. And then but the food was just inedible. It was awful. And I just remember this was literally the first day in Sarajevo. And I knew there was going to be shelling. And because we always had a shell count, and it was between 1,000 and 1,500 shells a day landing in center city, a couple of miles away from where we were. But I remember sitting down at the table, and suddenly there was this massive boom, and literally something had hit the building. There was no question. I heard glass shatter on the staircase outside. And I hit the deck, and I get onto the table, and then I look around, and everyone else is just carrying on eating. These French legions, they're just sitting there eating. I'm like, what happened? What happened? In French. And they go, oh, it was just a shell. I said, but it hit the building. Oh, yeah. They like to keep us on our toes, someone said. And I go, and I finish my meal, and I go out in the corridor, and literally this shell had the glass was that thick, but it still penetrated the glass on the stairwell. And I'm like, okay, fine. And then our room had like sandbags piled high so that if a shell landed just outside, then it wouldn't come into our living quarters. They weren't going to attack us to destroy us there. It was just they occasionally lobbed the shell at the UN just to keep them on their toes.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, so lots of
You
lots
must
of
have seen
games.
some quite shocking sights in Sarajevo then, as you had to go around doing your duties.
Yeah, it wasn't like we went there every time. That wasn't my job to go to where the shells landed and see the unfortunate carnage. I was there for the Market Massacre, which was when dozens of people were killed in one blow. I mean, I saw stuff on TV, local TV, because I was there. I wasn't actually there in the place. But I guess the worst thing I actually saw in Bosnia was a couple of years later when I was working for UNTV. And basically, so now I was out of the army and I was a producer for UNTV, and we were doing stories back and forth across the confrontation line. And this was when the Croatian army ethnically cleansed the Serbs in Serb Krajina, which was just adjacent to Croatia. A bit complicated, but in a nutshell, the Serbs were the Serb Orthodox supported by Russia, and the Croatians were the Catholics, and then the Muslims were the Muslims. But Croatia was Catholic, so that was Tudjman. Anyway, long story short is that we went to film a meeting between the mayor and of Serbs leaving the Serb Krajina. In other words, we wanted to get the story of them being ethnically cleansed, because everyone used to talk about Bosnians, Muslims being ethnically cleansed, Croatians being ethnically cleansed. This was Croatian Serbs being ethnically cleansed. So we get there, and again, this was I'm a civilian now. I'm a UNTV producer, and we get to this valley, and there's supposed to be a meeting in a village, and across the valley, I see plumes of smoke in a village, and I'm like, we should go there. Let's go there and see what's going on. And so we go down the valley. We're literally driving up like a creek to get to this little village where we'd seen the plumes of smoke. And it's pouring with the rain, but there's plumes of smoke. And then when we get to the village, every house is pretty much on fire. So as we near the village, there's 20 rows of unmarked, like no emblems on the side. Really weird. Like 20 SUVs, sort of military or police, we weren't sure. But no people, no people around, no soldiers. So we get to the village, and my cameraman, because I was working for UNTV, my cameraman starts filming. And this old woman in a Macintosh, like I remember she had a blue Macintosh, and she came out and she said, they killed my husband. They killed my husband. And we were like, what do you mean? What do you mean? She come with me. So we went into her house. She took us up the stairs into a bedroom, and her poor husband is lying on the floor in a pool of blood, chamber pot next to him. Basically, half his eye was missing because the bullet had gone. They'd shot him in the back of the head. And I'm thinking, journalist mode took over. We got to get this on camera. We got to do it. We got to do it. So my cameraman was like, "Oh, do you think we should do? You think we should film this? Yeah, if we get caught, kind of thing." But anyway, we filmed it, and we even filmed an interview with the woman. I tried to get her to. It was surreal because when you do an interview, journalism, you want people to give you whole sentences. And this poor woman, I just remember asking her, can you start from the beginning of your sentence? Give us a whole sentence. I had to, because I wanted her to explain exactly what had happened. And I wanted it to go somewhere and be on TV so people could see what was happening. So then we interview her. Then she says, and my best friend's husband they slit his throat. And we're like, what? And so she took us to another part of the village, and this poor old woman's there. And this time the husband had his throat slit or garroted, because it wasn't a bullet in the head. His throat was slit. And again, the poor guy's lying in a pool of blood. And we got it on camera. So that was pretty bad. But then I thought, we want to get a denial from the Croatians. Were they anything to do with this? So we go to the Croatian police general who was in the area, and we get this interview, and he doesn't know we've been there. He doesn't know that we've been to this village. It was called Grubor, Grubor, Grubor. And we get this great interview, and he has no idea that we've got all this footage. So he's denying categorically. But there's no one else it could have been, right? Because it's Croatians ethnically cleansing Serbs this time. Again, don't get me wrong, it happened on all sides. This just happened to be that way around. And just to finish the story, got this great interview, we got all the footage. But then we thought, if anyone stops us with this footage, even though we had a UN vehicle because we were UNTV, they're gonna confiscate it. They might arrest us. And so there was a helicopter coming in to the UN base nearby that day, and we just made sure the tapes were on that helicopter and taken back to our headquarters in Zagreb. And then I remember just driving hell for leather to the coast because, again, we didn't know if anyone had seen us, they would find out. And we just drove straight to the coast, back to the Split area, and they were just burning villages every few miles. It was crazy. It was just putting a button on your question. Those were so it wasn't even in the army at that stage. I did see a lot of shelling in Sarajevo, but the actual carnage firsthand, up close, that was worse.
How do you process that or deal with seeing scenes like that?
That's a great question. I don't think until it happens. And then I always feel like it's perhaps army training kicks in because when you train to be a soldier, you have this, you just go, you just fire, get up, down, fire, move. It's this blind obedience. And I think what happens, and again, it's all relative and personal, but I think I always knew what my job was in that moment, whether it was being in Sarajevo with shelling and seeing a dead body that had just been shelled. My job wasn't to rescue them or go and tend to them. That was someone else's job. I was a military observer, say, at that point. So my job was simply to give a report of what had happened, say. And then, like the stuff that I just talked about in Croatia, I just wanted someone to know about it. So I guess journalist mode just kicked in. And then obviously you're scared and it's terrifying and you don't want to get caught up with it, or you don't want to get caught being a witness to that. But I did actually go back to The Hague many years later to testify against the same Croatian general. And they flew me to The Hague, unmarked vehicle, dark windows, only had a number to identify me. And that was, again, another fascinating experience. Obviously, I basically told them what I saw in Bosnia and what we filmed. And because they had by this time got many other reports of the ethnic cleansing. And so I think it just not instinct's the wrong word, but maybe survival instinct just kicks in and you just do your job is the answer to your question.
So we've jumped ahead a bit because you were working for UNTV when what we were talking about there, but you have another tour as a United Nations military observer. And this time you're in Pale, which is the HQ of the Bosnian Serbs. You're only one of 3 UN observers there. And you are face to face with the chief perpetrators there because this is the HQ. So General Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic. You're there. Tell me what that is like.
So, I mean, it was out of the frying pan into the fire because I was in Sarajevo and that was pretty bad. And then I'm like, oh my God, the second tour, I went back as a United Nations military observer and I was in Pale, which is the Bosnian Serb stronghold just outside Sarajevo. They're the ones who are lobbing the shells into Sarajevo at the time. I'm like, oh my God, what's this going to be like? We were billeted in this kind of nice country house with fields around. And our job was to physically receive and send faxes to the Bosnian Serb headquarters and the political headquarters, which was Dr. Karadzic, Radovan Karadzic. And so literally we would go and sometimes physically get messages or faxes. Sometimes we would get them on our little local fax machine. And then we had a satellite fax in our office and we would fax those to the headquarters in Sarajevo, the UN headquarters, and sometimes Zagreb. Yasushi Akashi was the guy in charge at the time, if anyone interested. And then, so that was our job, it was communications. And then the thing was, though, the war was hotting up and suddenly there was NATO airstrikes looming and we were going to be stuck in the territory where the NATO airstrikes were going to happen. And so that was a little bit unnerving, but we got to know the people, like local police chief took us around, like literally show us around, wanted to be hospitable and show us that the Bosnian Serbs were not such bad people after all. I met Sonia Karadzic, who was Dr. Radovan Karadzic's daughter. She was like press and information officer. And And we had to be careful. The NATO airstrikes did happen, but I was actually on leave in London at the time. So I literally was watching on TV in London my friends in Parley. They literally had footage from Parley TV. And then it lasted for about a week. I called them and I said, how's it going? And they were just basically, they had to stay in, they were under house arrest effectively. So that was bizarre. But then we go back and things have got a little bit better again. And the police chief, who again we got to know, said, do you want to come for Easter Sunday lunch with Karadzic? And I'm thinking, maybe I shouldn't be fraternizing with the enemy. He said, yeah, come and have lunch Easter Sunday. You can meet Karadzic. And this police chief said, but if you want, we go skiing as well afterwards. So I go with the police chief and I'm like, I can't believe, and I had a camera, I had a video camera because I was doing it like a video diary for the BBC, in fact. And I had a camera. I thought, oh, I got to take pictures of this. It's crazy. And so I ended up on Sunday lunch, I think it was 94, perhaps. Can't remember the exact year. But anyway, going up with the police chief and having lunch with the enemy, this big banquet. There were army people, police people, civilians. It was waiter service. And I got a few clips of video, very short. In fact, I think one of my trailers has a picture of Radovan Karadzic in it. And I managed to get that shot of him because I thought this is just historical. And then after lunch, I did meet him. I met him. I shook his hand. I thought, should I even be shaking his hand? And he was very friendly. He didn't care I was there. UNMO Parley, we were called, United Nations Military Observer Parley. And then the police chief took me up to the ski slope after lunch. So you want to ski? You want to ski? No, I said, I don't know. And the amazing thing was, as we get to the ski slopes, there was like an artillery piece under this netting, which I wasn't supposed to know about. And that's literally where they were firing the mortars into Sarajevo from this artillery piece. And I guess we knew about it, sky imagery or whatever. They knew where it was. But again, I wasn't supposed to be there, but the police chief didn't care. And then I saw these soldiers and they were going up on the ski lift and they weren't skiing down. They were just coming down on the ski lift. And I said to this guy, I can't remember his name. I said, what? They want to ski? He said, no, they don't want to be injured. They want to go back to the front line. So they were literally having 24-hour leave. Some of them would just go and just relive the Sarajevo Olympic Games era. And they just sat in khaki, in camouflage uniform, to just sit and go up and down on the ski lift. Just such an interesting image that stays with me to this day. And anyway, and you're going back and forth, you're going near the front line. So as you drove to these places, the Sarajevo Winter Olympics luge, the remnants of it, is right next to the road. And there's these little huts with Bosnian Serb soldiers in. He said, should we stop and say hello? So we go in these huts. And he said, come see the front line. So literally like 50 yards away, more fortification. And they're shooting at these guys and they're shooting back. But then they say, who's there? Who's there? And they were talking to each other and saying, how's Ratko? How's Kostic? And they were literally talking to each other sometimes, but sometimes they were shooting at each other. It was just all so bizarre. I could go on and on, but I'll let you ask a question.
Fascinating. I didn't want to stop you there. It's civil war. It's neighbour against neighbour, isn't it? These people would have been living in the same street, possibly. When you look back at meeting somebody like Karadzic, you say he seemed quite affable and not particularly unusual. Yet he is the perpetrator of untold evil.
Major war crimes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, I guess it's what our leaders do the whole time, right? That people are. I remember when was it Ceausescu came to visit the Queen. I thought, how could she meet with him? He was such a brutal guy. But I think it's politics, international politics, right? And I guess I was nervous, and I thought, should I even be doing this? Because was it like bad form, bad protocol to even be in the same room as this scoundrel? But I did, and we didn't talk for long. He just said, what are you doing? How long have you been? How long are you going to be here? But there was another quick tale, I'll tell you. So towards the end of the war, the Bosnian Serb military and the parliament were deciding what to do before, I think the Americans had arrived, were arriving, Clinton getting involved. And they had this big summit at the Hotel Panorama, which was just near our house. And I thought, this is literally an historical moment. And so I was in civilian clothes and I was with a member of the UNHCR, and we were literally just having lunch. And then they said, there's a big meeting. Don't go in there. Don't go over there. And so it turned out that the entire Bosnian Serb military and political apparatus was meeting in this banquet hall just a few yards away. And I didn't know who was in there. I assumed Karadzic and Mladic. And remember, Mladic is one of the notorious war criminals of all time, as we just said. But as they come out, I'm like, oh, I've got to get footage of this. This was the journalist in me. I've got to get some footage of this. So I had my camera on the table, and it was a stupid thing to do that I guess only a young person would do. But I pressed record as the people started coming out, because I just thought this could be historic footage of this war ending, or the Bosnian Serbs deciding what to do finally after all these years of war. So I hit record, and they're all coming out, and I see Ratko Mladic coming out, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I've got him on camera. And then this woman called Zora, who I'd met and I'd been friendly to, she's on this balcony above, and she sees that she sees the red light on my camera. She sees that I'm filming, and she shouts to Mladic. She shouts, Umpravo vas snima. Umpravo's filming you. And everyone like stops. And what? And before I know it, I'm standing next to Ratko Mladic. Comes over to me, and he points to the camera, and one of his bodyguards takes the camera. And I stood up, and I said, and I'm like, I'm so totally screwed here. So I stood up, and I wasn't even wearing uniform. And I just said, yes, I'm covered done. Nice to meet you, General. I just wanted to get some pictures of this momentous occasion. I couldn't think of anything else to say. And he looked at me, and he's literally 3 feet away. And he says, Mladic, which is young man, you only have one life. And he turned and he went, and that was it. And they took my camera, and his bodyguards joked about it afterwards. Said, Richard, the photographer. And so in the end, it wasn't a big deal. I never got the camera back or the video back. But yeah, so that was another little fun tale that I had out there.
Chilling.
Yeah, I got away with it.
I did look at some of the video on your YouTube channel, because you've got excerpts from the video diary you were filming in Parlay on there. And I'll have links to those in the episode information as well. It's a great insight, and I really appreciate you sharing the detail there. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about aspirations to act, and after you've finished those tours in Bosnia and have left the army, you actually work on the film Welcome to Sarajevo. Were you an advisor on? Were you acting in that?
Yeah, so that was another, again, coming back to the languages, fun sort of byproduct of learning Bosnian and Russian. When I left the army I wanted to do some more work as behind the scenes in film production, and I got a job on Welcome to Sarajevo, directed by Michael Winterbottom, produced by Graham Broadbent, who many years later won an Oscar for one of his movies. But it was about an orphanage. The movie called Welcome to Sarajevo was about getting this little girl out of Sarajevo. And it wasn't long after the end of the war. There were lots of amazing scenes still, bombed out buildings, tram lines down. But this was a feature film movie. And so I was a third assistant director. And that involves just getting the actors to the movie set. It was starring Stephen Delane, Woody Harrelson, Marisa Tomei, who I had a big crush on because she's so beautiful. And so where we were in Sarajevo filming this. And then I remember one day I was watching Stephen Delane and Woody Harrelson sitting on a pile of rubble, and they were talking, they were chatting. And then suddenly the first assistant director shouted, "Cut." And they'd been talking in a scene in the movie, and I hadn't realized they were filming. And I thought, I think I want to do that. So that's when I got the idea and the bug, the sort of acting bug. And in fact, Michael Winterbottom gave me a small part in the movie as a UN interpreter I the when they stop at a checkpoint and the UN official tells everyone to get back in the bus, and they have the UN soldier, which is me dressed as a Canadian soldier in a blue beret, coming as the interpreter, and I go, one of us, autobus. If anyone ever watches that movie called Welcome to Sarajevo. But yeah, that was another fun sort of experience just to do that and do a little bit of acting.
Was it at all difficult reliving what you'd seen for real on a movie set?
No, it was actually easy because you knew it was just pretend. And being in that movie, again, that was my very first sort of taste. It was such an incredible setting, Sarajevo, bombed out Sarajevo. And I'd always been interested in thrillers and spy movies, and it was pretty exciting stuff, this movie. It's a drama. It's not exactly a thriller, but no, it's much easier because it's just pretend. And I always say the real heroes, when you see these actors doing these amazing roles, but the real heroes are actually the real soldiers and the real policemen who do the real stuff. Acting is just play acting.
While we were doing this interview, we mentioned your books. Just tell me about your writing career and what has inspired you to expand your world even further, your creative world even further.
Yeah, so I always loved reading. I loved thrillers. And as I mentioned, when I was in Khabarovsk studying in Russia, I just thought, wow, this would be the frozen river, the frozen tundra, the Chinese mountains, North Korea in the distance. I thought this would be a great place for a novel. So probably 10 to 15 years ago, I started writing, and it took me probably 5 years or so to write the first 2 North Korea Deception, Hyde Park Deception. And I just love it. And I love everything about writing, the researching, the writing, the sort of creative buzz that you get. I actually enjoy all the marketing side as well. And so I've written 4 books. The 4th book, Crown Deception, is coming out. And in fact, the Crown Deception is the explosive prequel to the Deception series. And it involves Jack Steele, the hero, his great aunt Florence, who lived and worked with the royal family, British royal family, for 30 years. It involves her becoming embroiled in a secret conspiracy to do with Tsar Nicholas II and King George V, and a secret sort of long lost medal. And I've now got Crown Deception, Leningrad Deception, Hyde Park Deception, and North Korea Deception.
Yeah, and Crown Deception is a rattling good story. Thanks for letting me have access to a copy of that. And you've even got a bit of your family history in there as well, haven't you?
Yeah, there's a book written by my aunt about my great aunt. It's called From Cottage to Palace. And my aunt writes about my great aunt who lived and worked with the royal family. So there's this shot taken in South Africa on HMS Vanguard in 1947. And my great aunt Flo is standing there, and the photograph is signed by King George VI, the Queen Mother, Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret. And it's just always fascinated me, this photograph, and thinking, what must it have been like for my great aunt Flo? Because as a child, 7 to 10 years old, probably I would go to her sort of retirement home in Great Malvern in Worcestershire. And she'd always tell stories to my mother of the latest royal tours and Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. And so I would listen. I was pretty bored. I wasn't really interested. I had no clue what that meant on the big scheme of things. But anyway, a couple of people said, oh, you should use your great aunt in a story one. And I couldn't really figure out how I was going to do that. But the picture, the cover of Crown Deception, I don't know whether you can see it, but it's always fascinated me that King George V, I don't even know which is which, and Tsar Nicholas II were, almost identical. And I've always thought, how can that be? So those two things, that portrait of Tsar Nicholas II and King George V, who could be identical twins, and the photograph of my great aunt Flo on HMS Vanguard in 1947 were the sort of roots to this story called Crown Deception.
Yeah, and it features a very young Jack Steele in there as well. Now, I did quite a bit of research on this interview, Richard, because I wanted to make sure we were covering almost every base here. But one interview that you did where you described that Jack Steele is 30 to 50% autobiographical.
Wow, you're very ridiculous there, Ian.
Well,
very good. Very
Do you
good.
want to
I'm impressed.
elaborate on how much you are a part of this series, aside from being the author of it?
Yeah, I think most writers would be lying if they said most of the characters in their books are either themselves, the thoughts they've had, the feelings they have, the people they've known. In the early days, writers I read used to talk about research, and I just started realizing that I got a lot of real life events, places, locations that I can simply use. And as long as I add in a story, a page turner, and conflict, and there needs to be conflict on every page, as I always tell myself, or one of the early writing books I read always said, you've got to have conflict on every page. Yeah, that's my technique, is that I just say, I love that place, Vienna or Leningrad or Moscow, Paris. And so I guess you could say the locations are sort of characters in a way, as again, writers do sometimes say, but just using those places that I've been and then creating a sort of interesting, compelling, exciting story around that. And then it's just easier to think, how would I think about this situation? What would I do in this situation? I just find that easier than, obviously, I do make a lot up, but a lot of the thoughts and feelings and experiences are what I either think I might have or what I actually did have. So in some ways, I find that's the easiest. It seems like I'm cheating sometimes because I've got it all worked out already. For example, the next book, I feel like I would want to start it on the Potyomkinskaya Lesnitsa in Odessa, and I would go back to that being robbed that time, and that might be a great place to start a novel, because it's always about what if. I'm always thinking, what if this happened here? What if this happened now? And then you've got to make sure that has conflict. That's how I write. So I think, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but come in there. I'm not sure if we went off on a tangent.
I think you did. I think you did. It's as I said, with the young Jack Steele, you're obviously describing your great aunt's home there. You're basing it on experiences of being with her there and understanding her history. And obviously, where you've got aspects of it set in Bosnia or during the Cold War, you're basing that on some of it on your military experiences.
So yeah, it was just easy to use all those military locations and experiences. And again, I try to weave that into the story. If anyone ends up reading my books, I hope you will, but you will recall many of the events that I've talked about in the podcast here, in those books.
There are links to Richard's books, the Deception series, in the episode information. Want to learn more about this episode? Don't miss the extras, such as curated videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. Special thanks to the generous efforts of our financial supporters who keep the show on the air. If you'd like to join this select band, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.